Thomas, welcome again to Radio Wolf. I'm very happy to have you on again.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
And I wanted to talk with you about the metamodern movement, so to say, because the metamodern movement, as far as I see, the meme is spreading. There are more and more people who use the term, who use a framework they call metamodern. At the same time, obviously, we are in a civilizational crisis where the prospect of the evolving future is not exactly what the focus is on. We have the climate crisis, we have the energy crisis, we have the war crisis. We can go on. There's more a perspective right now, basically how to survive in this.
Yes.
How do you think metamodern is developing in the last 5 years? Where is metamodern going right now?
Yes, and of course that depends a little bit on what you mean with the metamodern. I mean, in a very, very broad sense, you could see the metamodern as just a placeholder for whatever comes after the postmodern, whatever. But then in a more narrow sense, there is starting to develop some sort of philosophical or sociological insights around what this metamodern could actually be. But if we start in the broader sense first, I think more and more people are realizing that we are in a societal transition, and that the transition that we are in right now will be at least as deep and significant, and also perhaps turbulent, as the transition from the pre-modern into the modern society. And there we already have the terms pre-modern and modern. And then, of course, for the last 50 years, at least, we have had some sort of postmodern critique of modernity and the Enlightenment project, if you want. And of course, this modernity and the Enlightenment project has given us so many wonderful things, I would say, like modern medicine, human rights, democracy, that we, of course, would not want to be without. But then at the same time, postmodern philosophical critique of modernity points out many of modernity's naive assumptions or beliefs and blind spots. So in many ways, the postmodern critique has been very valuable. But the problem with a postmodern perspective is that it is really a perspective that's coming from deconstruction and critique, and can very easily end up in a very relativistic space with really no direction and a general suspicion against all meta-narratives and stories. And from such a perspective, it is very difficult to build something new. So when you ask, where is the metamodern project right now? In this sense, sort of the feeling that modernity has come to some sort of end, and that we really make a transition into something, and that this something is beyond postmodern critique, beyond just postmodern critique of modernity. That is something that is gaining more and more traction, I think. Whether one wants to use the term metamodern for such a move, such a new civilization, such a new worldview. And I would say generally, in looking at this transition that we are in right now, it could really go in many ways. And I studied mathematics and physics, and I'm still very fond of trying to see the world and humanity and civilization and culture as a self-organizing social system that is rapidly approaching what we in systems theory might call a tipping point or a bifurcation point. And when a system comes to a bifurcation point, then per definition, incremental change is not any longer possible. But you really need to have a phased transition. And ideally, the system would step up through a breakthrough to a higher level of organization, to a more complex, but perhaps also more elegant way of organizing. But if the system can't do that, it will face a breakdown. And today, what could a breakdown look like? Well, it could look like we are sort of entering into a time of complete fragmentation, perhaps even breakdown of world order, breakdown of nation states. And it could be sort of everyone's war against everyone, where we would probably lose a lot of our technological development that we have had during the last, say, 50 years and enter into a state of chaos. So that is one, what we in system science terms would call an attractor, a point of stability where the system could end up. The alternative that many people see to that chaos is to go into some sort of authoritarian system, either a political authoritarian system like the one we see, for example, in developing in China, or some sort of feudal, high-tech, capitalist authoritarian system where the big tech companies would dominate the world and sort of control us. And that would be a second attractor. But then, of course, what we are all looking for is a third attractor, a metamodern attractor, somehow stepping up civilization to a more complex, a more elegant way of arranging the world. And what could that look like is sort of the core question for me in the Metamodern project.
Mm-hmm. As you are describing these different attractors, let's call it the Chinese attractor of, how you want to call it, digital state capitalism.
Yeah.
Let's call the other the new digital feudalism attractor.
Which is an authoritarian arrangement in a I wouldn't use the word free market, but it would not be, it would be the opposite to a political authoritarian. It would be a free market, but still authoritarian regime.
I also see in this constellation, also in the constellation of a mega crisis that we are undoubtedly are in, attractors that are connected to what you're saying, which are more identity based, back to our ethnic identity, and find some security in the national state that we are in right now. Forget about globalization. Let's basically focus on the nation state that we are in, and let's kind of keep the world out. This is one thing.
Yeah.
And then there's another.
That is sort of my fragmentation scenario. And of course, it could be a fragmentation on the level of nation states, but possibly also we see many nation states that might fragment in such a scenario, and it would be even smaller units competing in such a world.
And then there is a attractor, as I see it in the younger generation, that's very much coming from a deep criticism of Western civilization as such, and orienting themselves in pre-modern indigenous form of before alienation, let's call it that way, and a form of spirituality and connection to nature that allows us to treat the world, Earth, in a way that is not as destructive as our modernist culture does it right now.
No.
In this constellation of attractors, where do you see there's something where you think these are kind of emerging spots of a possible metamodern integral development where there is something birthed right now that can be signs of the future?
Yeah. I would first just say that when we are using the term as you just did and talking about the sort of meta crisis, I think that is a very important first step if you want to get into a metamodern worldview, to really realize that all these different crises that you mentioned earlier, like the environmental crisis, the breakdown of democracy, psychological ill health, and all of this, that there is so much attention right now to trying to solve and attack these different crises with different types of actions and programs. But I think that we have to realize that these crises are actually very much interlinked, and they might just be symptoms of this underlying meta crisis, which is really a crisis of our worldview and our understanding, and perhaps even a crisis in our being, in the way that we are in the world. And at least it is a crisis of our psychological resources, or our lack of psychological resources to be able to live and make meaning in such a complex and multicultural and rapidly shrinking world that we are actually living in today. And of course, one way to sort of avoid all of these problems would be just to go back to what we might perceive as wrongly perceive as a better time 150 or 100 years ago, and go back to smaller social groups, give up the globalization project, give up the idea of one humanity, and gather in these smaller social groups, and end up in a fragmented world, in a medieval world with lots of small social groups that are competing for resources and have difficulties in cooperating.
Where I came from with this question, where do you see kind of emerging signs of metamodern, also coming from observations that I have moving through different circles, and particular right now again, there's a whole milieu of young people that I often meet in Berlin, in places like Berlin, where when I talk with them and engage with them, I realize that they are somehow already living in a different world. And what I mean with this different world is very simple. The way they use, for example, social media, and here more apps like Telegram than Facebook, where they live a form of interconnectedness with a kind of a non-geographically association with people that is an ongoing moving whole that's so different than how I grew up with identity, individuality, and the kind of, from this perspective, linearity of development, that I just see there is a different form of consciousness building in these young people that is also a mixture of being very earth oriented, very ecological oriented, at the same time being completely technological positive. There is a whole hopefulness in the possibility of technology creating something with us that is with the earth and not against the earth, which I try to figure out what is really going on there. But when I try to fantasize, where do I see this signs of postmodernity, I feel that in this young milieu, there's definitely something happening where I see this is different than how I grew up. There's a different consciousness that's creating something very different than the culture I knew.
You know, I totally agree with you there. And you mentioned earlier also that there is an increased interest in indigenous wisdom and in indigenous culture. And I just came back yesterday from a gathering at the Ekskäret Island, my foundation's island outside Stockholm, where we had gathered a group of people, including representatives from the Kogi people in the Amazonas and the Sami people from north of Sweden and the Inuit people, and really asking this question, what could we today learn from indigenous thinking and indigenous culture without sort of following into some sort of romantic trap that we believe that all indigenous life is sort of easy and harmonious, and that it would be easy to translate these ancient cultures that have been functioning well in connection to nature and in some cases very good social harmony, but in relatively small groups of a couple of hundred people into today's world. So I think there is a lot we can learn, but it has to, just as you point out, it has, I believe, to be married with all the good fruits of modernity and with technology. And as much as I see technology today being very much a threat against both psychological well-being and even social harmony and even democracy, I at the same time definitely think that it will be technology that will fundamentally enable us to take this step into a new civilization that will make it possible for us to coordinate resources in a much more intelligent way than we are doing today with a relatively stupid market, with all the externalities and all the problems that the market is creating, but also help us in coordinating narratives and collective decision making in much more intelligent ways than the present implementation of democracy allows us to do. So yes, I'm both looking back to pre-modern and indigenous thinking and living, but also looking forward at the same time and putting hope and faith in technology. The big question is, of course, if this awakening that I definitely see happening, and as you say, I definitely see a new way of being and relating to these problems in the younger generations, and specifically in the millennials. But at the same time, there are so many forces that are dragging us down in our pursuit, and it will somehow be a race against time. Will this small but rapid awakening be able to get enough momentum before we have a serious environmental or social collapse.
Mm-hmm. As this is very much also about our relationship to modernity and everything that modernity brought, and as this is also in the context of postmodern critique of modernity, I see a split in society and consciousness that came with COVID that I find very significant, and I don't know where it goes. That in the alternative milieus, in the kind of critique how society was dealing with the COVID crisis, there was a critique that to a big degree is also a justified critique about our technological response to something like a virus. And all the kind of one-dimensional response of society that did not include other perspectives in that. But in this, there is also a phenomenon that came out very powerful, and that I really kind of, it surprised me and it surprised others. The term that stands for this to some degree is the term conspirituality. The convergence of a spiritual mindset and this leaning to conspiracy theory thinking that is, to my understanding, very much related to our understanding of perspectives that are beyond the modernist perspective, but also not fall into kind of a naive anti-scientific thinking that basically, if it's not modern, if it's not scientific, then it is already the good thing, which you very easily can end in a QAnon mentality in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Couldn't continue.
No, please finish off.
That there's something in this split, that is a split of people who were very long, very befriended. This relationship, and I think it's very much about a metamodern perspective, to have a perspective that is capable of the critique of the scientific or scientistic perspectives, but is not hostile to science.
No.
And to have this differentiation is something that's building out right now, where I feel that many people who have rightfully very critical understanding of where science brought us to have a very naive understanding of the critique of science.
Yes.
And the capacity to hold both at the same time is something that we have to accomplish right now.
Yes. So the critical word there is capacity. So in a more narrow sense, how I define a metamodern worldview, that is going beyond just sort of a positive reconstructive postmodernism, would definitely be to put an emphasis on the integration of science with other ways of knowing, but also at the same time having a focus on the importance of our possibility of lifelong inner growth and maturation, and that we need a society that supports that development and inner growth in as many individuals as possible, because it's only by building the capacities of seeing the world in more perspectives, being able to hold more perspectives in your mind, even to hold paradox. It's only with the development of that capacity that you can move beyond this naive critique of modernity. And if you look at the cultural evolution of humanity, so far on Earth, if we take a look over thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years, so then you can see that in every substantial step up in our culture, through, for example, the Enlightenment revolution and the Industrial Revolution and the development of democracy and all of that, it has always put more demands on the psychological resources of the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you were certainly suffering more in many ways in a medieval society, when it comes to the psychological maturity that is needed to live in a medieval society where your role and place was given by birth, and 99% of the population just had to try to survive by obeying their lord.
Mm-hmm.
That lack of freedom, of course, makes it possible to function on a much simpler psychological level than as we have today in modernity, where you are free to develop your life in any direction you want. You can study whatever you want. You can pursue careers. You really have to invent the purpose of your life and even the meaning of your life yourself. And of course, that puts a lot of more psychological pressure on us all, at the same time as it gives us a lot of more freedom. A metamodern world would be a world with even more freedom, but it would put even more load on us in being able to handle that freedom. So the very important step in the process of moving beyond modernity, for me, is about helping many people develop the psychological resources or the maturity or the wisdom necessary to not just survive in such a society, but actually thrive and be able to be co-creators of such a society. And that's, of course, why I'm so engaged in this project, the Inner Development Goals, which is a framework for supporting such large-scale development of psychological capabilities.
Yeah. No, but what you're pointing to here, I think, is really core in when we try to look where is this meta-modern attraction point really capable of living. How can we hold the complexity of more freedom?
Yeah.
In this, and to use
that freedom, I just want to point out that freedom, the metamodern freedom, is certainly more freedom on an individual level, but it is not just on an individual level. The big step up in freedom from modernity to the metamodern will be in our collective freedom, in our freedom to actually design our societies and culture, and consciously design both society and structures and our culture. So far, we as humanity have more or less just being subject to the societal and cultural evolution. Now we need to become much more self-aware of that process. And if we are going to be able to realize that collective freedom, then we need to be able to have collective decision-making in these areas. And for that, we need collective sense-making. And that is really what is lacking in today's world, our ability to collectively make sense of our world.
Interesting that you're going there, because there is something that in our work, in our evolved work, is very central for us as a focus point, because something that modernity and postmodernity in their antagonism seem to have together is their focus on individualism.
Yes.
In different ways.
Yes. Of course, in modernity, it is the freedom of the individual, the political freedom of the individual, and the belief in the rational, self-maximizing individual, and that through the market and other mechanisms would then move the world forward. And in post-modernity, it's the identity politics and the intersectionality that is sort of dividing humanity into smaller and smaller groups. And at the end of the day, we just have the individuals standing alone.
And what I hear you saying, that to make a step forward here, we need to really go deep in understanding our identity as being hyper-individual, modern, postmodern citizen of this world, and see that this is something that is so natural for us to basically look from this hyper-individuated perspective, that anything that's not that immediately looks very collectivistic, or kind of traditional in kind of old church or tribal form of traditional, but that there's a different possibility that's not a pre-trans fallacy backward, but there's a new form of interdependence and a trans individuation that we have not tapped into, seems to be crucial to liberate us from this identity.
Absolutely. So when I speak about the importance of the collective aspects of reality and the collective decisions that we need to make, this is not at all going back to some sort of socialistic or communistic worldview, nor is it to some sort of monocultural, old religious way of controlling culture, but it's really being able to realize that this interdependence that you're talking about, which is both social and cultural interdependence, that is something that we have and that we are subject to as individuals and as society, whether we are aware of it or not. And once we become aware of it, then we gain the freedom to form those aspects of our interdependence. But in order to do that, at least if we should be able to do that in a democratic way, then we need to develop our ability to collectively make sense and collectively talk about these things. And again, today it seems like collective sense making is not developing, but rather breaking down rapidly all over the world.
And that's also why I really I appreciate very much the Inner Development Goal initiative that you kind of co-created here, which focuses also on our capacities to hold this multiplying levels of complexity that this world undeniably seems to be about. And there is no way to evade this complexity besides some regressive going back to my tribe, to my leader, to my dogma. These forms of regression are the only ways to avoid this. So if we don't want to go there, we as an individual, but also as a collective, also in our togetherness, have to develop capacities to hold forms of complexity that we never were asked to hold, in a way. As you're describing in medieval time, part of as rough as it may have been, but there was a big relief in knowing that I was in my region, in my village, in my language area, in my religion, and I knew who I was, who my family was, who the emperor was, and who the pope was.
And I never met any strangers. And everyone that I was meeting and interacting with had the same worldview and the same belief and the same skin color.
And it is very obvious that in order to allow us to cope with this new forms of complexity, we have to find new ways of learning that.
And it's important just to point out that these capacities and to handle this complexity, that this is certainly not just cognitive. Of course, there is a cognitive element to this, but there is at least as much emotional complexity today that we need to handle, and that can be even more difficult than cognitive complexity, because at least in modernity we have been focusing on our cognitive abilities and we are used to thinking about our cognitive capacities, whereas our emotional capacities and our relational capacities, we are not in modernity used to think about and notice in the same way. And finally, we are also so used to focus on these capacities only from an individual perspective. But here, of course, in the development goals, we are also talking about the need to develop the collective aspects of these capacities. So it's really quite complex. There's many dimensional, many facets of this capacity building.
Yeah. As you know, I really like the work of John Bjorkman.
Yeah.
And part of what he brings here, and I also like that he does it in a very scientific way, a philosophical scientific way, that he talks about our lost forms of knowledge. And basically making exactly the point right now that our modernist, postmodern discourse basically allows only one form of knowledge, that he calls it prepositional knowledge, but basically it's the cognitive knowledge that you're talking about. But there are different forms of knowing that in traditional cultures were accepted as being forms of knowing, which is our relational, emotional connectedness, being here-ness, as forms of knowing that he tries to understand from a scientific point of view as being something that in themselves are knowledge forms that we with our form of science have reduced to cognition.
Yeah, no, and it's important to point out that these other ways of knowing was core part even of our Western civilization up until some point, and that already Aristotle pointed out these things. But then again, I think many of these views of ways of knowing was a bit lost during the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, when in a very, very good effort, of course, to get rid of a lot of old superstitious knowledge and religious dogmatic knowledge, we only focused on this sort of cognitive empirical knowledge. But in doing so, we threw out a bit of some babies with that bath water, including some very important insights from Aristotle and other founders of the Western thinking.
In the beginning of this conversation, I asked you where you think the metamodern movement is going. And I also asked you where you see signs of emergence of that. And the way I understand our conversation right now is that it's very much related to kind of milieus that are able to develop these new forms of complexity holding in that sense. And also the way you described it, that we are not talking about cognitive complexity, which in form is a reduction itself. And I do see in many places, and again, for me, coming from Germany, Berlin stands for that, but there are places in the US, there are places in the Nordic countries, there are other places where there is a new generation that playfully leans into holding that, experimenting with that, and of course making also their own whatever with this.
And experimenting with this in smaller communities and in larger festivals and things. I mean, if we're looking at the very large scale, you can talk about the Burning Man movement, not only the festival in the Nevada desert, but also similar events going on in Europe and in other places, where you gather anything from 500 people up until 50,000 people in a festival where you are really experimenting with new ways of relating, new way of constructing the social interaction between people. But also and we see this in Stockholm, and I'm involved in a co-living project here in Stockholm called K9, where we have 50 people living together in a conscious community in central Stockholm, 20 different nationalities, and really experimenting with new ways of living and being together. And I think it will be from experiments like these that we have been mentioning that the new might emerge. And the more experiments we do, the more we learn. And we need to experiment, and we need to fail. We need to fail fast, and we need to try again and yeah, experiment. Because what we are really doing is that we are moving into an emerging future, which means that we cannot, even in principle, envision what the future will be like. But even if we can't see the future, we must still act and try to experiment and try to support the emergence of something new. So building bridges into the fog is a metaphor that I sometimes use. And we need to be building many bridges into the fog, and some of them will fail, but some of them I'm sure will work. And it's from those experiments that the new will have a chance to grow.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to recognize that this is going on, because a lot of that happens under the radar. Yes. It definitely happens under the radar of our political news and also our reports about the civilization crisis that we're in. But there are a lot of incubation constellations going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
People
and one reason why it is not reported on is that if you don't have, say, a metamodern understanding, a postmodern understanding of what is going on, then you don't really see what is going on, or you don't see the benefits of these small experiments. So then you don't know what the news value is. But there is certainly a lot of things going on, and that makes me very, very hopeful. At the same time as we seem to be sliding backwards very rapidly at the same time. So that's where we are a bit.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, not to be naively optimistic here. I mean, the outcome is very open, including the climate catastrophe. We don't know basically how we will go through this or don't go through this.
Yeah.
And,
so, but I think one sad insight I've had during the last couple of years is that, yes, we are heading towards a climate catastrophe, and we need to do everything we can to avoid that. But probably what will hit us before the climate crisis hits us as individuals will be the breakdown of our society, will be breakdown of democracy. So, yeah.
And I also would like to address it the other way around, because I think that is also the significance and the importance of metamodern thinking. Because as you described it just now, you need this kind of framework in order to understand the significance of all these little different things that are going on. So it also works around that in the capacity to hold a different understanding of a possibility where a complex society can go.
Yeah.
All these little things that are very different, they are all kind of chaotic and start to make sense they would not do otherwise.
No.
So I see the metamodern perspective also as a factor that allows these different movements to understand better for themselves who they are and who they could be.
Yeah, and that's of course part of the Emerge project. And we met, you and I, most recently at the Emerge gathering in Berlin during a year ago. And at the beginning of the summer, we had an Emerge gathering in Austin, Texas, with exactly this idea of bringing together many of these small initiatives or individuals working in this space, but coming from very many different backgrounds, coming from, yes, philosophical perspective, new economic systems perspective, coming from personal development and coaching perspectives, could come from a psychedelics perspective, many different perspectives, and starting to realize that in some deeper respect, we are all trying to work on and contribute to the same societal evolution, and to start becoming self-aware of what is going on in the world, and to start seeing the strength of what's going on when you start to see the totality.
Yeah. Tomas, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.